There is a future Ukraine that would be within its current territorial boundaries, so not back to pre-2022 or pre-2014 boundaries, but that would be both outside of NATO, which would be a Russian demand, and well-armed and able to defend itself, which would be a Ukrainian demand. And that's sort of this model of armed non-alignment that some people have talked about. And it would be defensively armed and capable of defending itself, not capable of mounting an offensive and posing a threat to Russia. And I think that's the most likely and the most feasible outcome. The frustrating thing is that everyone seems to recognize that, and we still can't get there.
Yeah. Yeah, not everyone recognizes it. Not on the Ukraine side. They don't want any limitations at all. In fact, many in the European side don't either.
Well, just one point before we move on, I'll make is that in terms of this question of they don't want any caps at all. True, they don't want any caps, but feasibly, what they'll be able to field in terms of an army is limited. So they can't have a 1 million man army. It's not possible. I've been doing some of the math, and their army is going to be considerably smaller just based on what they can resource and support with demographics and their budget. Yeah. So
that gets too little explanation. That is such an important point. Even post war, no matter what it comes out, they're going to have a hard time demographically with a number of men that are of military age to even keep a military sustained even into peacetime. That's going to be a big challenge, I think.
Yeah. So accept a cap of 250,000 or 300,000 people. You probably won't even be able to reach that. Then you've accepted a cap.
That's a great point.
You look like you made a concession, but you actually didn't because you couldn't get there anyway. And that would be actually enough to defend Ukraine sufficiently. And similarly on military capabilities, there's this idea that Russia wants a demilitarized Ukraine, like no weapons. If you talk to Russians, that's not what they want. There's a lot of gray area. There are some things they're very concerned about: combat aircraft, early warning aircraft that get Western intelligence, long-range missiles, and other types of sort of like long-range strike capabilities, and long-range air defense radars that can see deep into Russia and collect data. Those are their 4 main areas of concern. Everything else, they have much
negotiable.
Is negotiable. So this is like a totally feasible outcome that would leave Ukraine secure and would address Russia's security concerns. It's just getting past where we are currently, which is why I find it frustrating, because it seems like it's just out of reach,
Yeah, but if with a little bit of sanity and willingness to make difficult compromises, does seem to be achievable. But back to Trump again, number 3 on your list was don't overestimate your own leverage. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think it's important for Trump to be realistic about where his sources of leverage are. He does have a good negotiating position. But when it comes to Russia, that negotiating position doesn't come from threats of sanctions, as we've discussed. Sanctions aren't going to really change Putin's calculus, especially in the near term. It doesn't come from military threats, really, because we've talked, previously, and obviously this has been covered elsewhere, that there aren't that many weapons in European stocks, that U.S. production is slow, and that Ukraine's biggest problem is manpower. So with Putin, Trump's biggest leverage is the ability to walk away. Putin really needs Trump's engagement to get some of his war aims achieved. Decisions on Ukraine's NATO membership, decisions on Europe's security architecture. These are things that only the United States can really provide. So
another great point.
So Putin needs the U.S. involved, and that's Trump's biggest leverage with Putin, the ability to walk away. With Ukraine, he has a lot more leverage, especially as Ukraine's battlefield lines start to collapse. But it's not infinite, because Ukraine could decide to keep fighting. At that point, the United States could say, fine, you want to fight, we're done, and walk away. Which would be fine for U.S. interests, but it does not address Trump's desire to have peace. So that's not useful for Trump if that's the goal. The key is just to be realistic about what he can force Zelensky to do. And I think we talked about this just, when we were talking about some of the other things on my list. Accepting current lines of the current front lines, I think that is realistic. Asking Ukraine to withdraw from territory that it currently controls, much harder.
right, politically. I'm going to get to that one there about walking away here in a minute, because that's kind of your bottom line. I want to get there second, but let's move. One of the other ones I think is not as intuitive to a lot, but maybe really important, and that is, don't let spoilers talk you out of difficult decisions. And we had maybe this is a good representation of what one might be trying to do. This was yesterday when Emmanuel Macron came out of that meeting with Trump and Zelensky in Berlin. Here's what he had to say.
Le deuxième élément sur lequel les choses ont été très claires et exprimées ainsi par le président Trump, c'est que les questions territoriales qui relèvent de l'Ukraine ne peuvent être négociées et ne seront négociées que par le président ukrainien. Et c'est la position que nous soutenons. Elle a été très clairement exprimée par le président Trump, et donc elle augure d'une réunion à venir.
Except, of course, that the Russians came out and said, yeah, we're not even talking about that, about us giving away anything in these talks coming up. So if you have the French saying, hey, this needs to be a key part of it, Trump, when you talk to him on Friday. And so that would seem to be, if they talk Trump into that would seem to be a problem. What do you mean when you say, don't let others talk you out of difficult decisions?
Well, I mean, since the beginning of Trump's second presidency here, we've seen resistance to his efforts to reach out to Russia. Every time he tries to reach out to Russia, it elicits just, wails of complaints from Europe and from other quarters about how this is appeasement and Trump is giving Ukraine away and you can't negotiate with Putin, et cetera, and keep coming back to the same maximalist demands. Ukraine must have binding security guarantees. Ukraine must have NATO membership. Ukraine cannot sacrifice any territory. And to me, this is just a recipe for never-ending war, because those ends will never be achieved, just feasibly. We may want those things to happen, but they're just not going to happen given battlefield realities. And Putin is never going to settle the war after all this time and then give up on the key things that he fought the war for in the first place. So these are just non-starters as conditions for peace. And so for me, this is just a recipe, for never-ending war. And in my view, the Europeans, by putting this forward, a benevolent view is that they have Ukraine's best interests at heart, and maybe they do to some extent. A more cynical view is that they really want the U.S. involved in Europe. They're terrified of having to stand on their own 2 feet to provide for their own security. And if the United States stops paying attention to Ukraine, it's also apt to sort of slowly draw away from Europe. And the Ukraine issue keeps the U.S. involved. And so the longer the war continues, the better for Europe. And so, for me, Europe is really the big spoiler here with their sort of red lines and demands. And I have to admit that when I read this, German leaders, French leaders saying these are the European demands, well, I'm sorry, but you underspent on your defense for 80 years and you decided to free ride on U.S. military power for decades. You don't get to make demands anymore. It doesn't matter what you think.
Just being blunt. Yeah, I mean, that's just where it's at. And hopefully President Trump will adopt that very view. Now, the last few minutes we got here, this is the biggest one here, because you say that Trump should not be afraid to walk away. Now, that's a pretty potentially big minefield. I want you to talk about this in a little bit more detail with the time you have left, because if Trump goes to this meeting on Friday and agrees to anything, or finds out that he can't get Putin to agree on anything at all, and says, fine, I'm going to walk away, then he runs the risk, both at home and in Europe, of being accused of, you just walked in to Vladimir Putin on American soil and handed him a victory. How does he avoid that and still not run afoul of your point number 5?
So I think, just to keep coming back to U.S. interests, the U.S. interest in Ukraine is very small. The U.S. had an interest in preventing Russia from overrunning Ukraine, and it accomplished that goal. And at this point, the risks involved to the United States of staying involved are much higher than any gains. I see the risks as 2. The first is it continues to drain U.S. military capacity, readiness, and materiel. And the second is that anytime you have the U.S. and Russia tangled up somewhere, even if it's indirectly, you have the risk of escalation, and that escalation could include nuclear use. Ukraine is definitely not worth a nuclear war between the United States and Russia. So for the United States, the number one goal here should be to get itself out of Ukraine permanently. No ties, nothing, no long-term commitments. And peace is one way to do that. A peace arrangement that keeps Ukraine secure and able to defend itself allows the United States to walk away. But it's not the only way. Because the United States has few interests at stake here, it can walk away without damaging U.S. national security. So all Trump really needs to do here is to keep coming back to his main principle, America first. That these, his priority in these negotiations should be protecting American interests. And if it seems like a peace deal is at hand that he can help use his leverage and his influence to achieve that advances U.S. interests, then he should absolutely do it. But if there's no peace deal to be had, if Russia if Putin is unwilling to compromise and seems unyielding even in the face of, the pressure that's been put on him by the Biden administration and by Europe, and if Ukraine isn't willing to make concessions, then it makes sense for the U.S. to walk away. And
in the last couple of minutes we have, what do you say to those naysayers who argue against that by saying, no, if Trump walks away and, quote, hands a victory to Russia, it will deeply wound and damage America's national security and their reputation and credibility and will embolden others. I hear this all the time, especially China and Taiwan. What say you?
Well, the research that we have on how the credibility of nations globally translates suggests that it just doesn't generalize that way. So China doesn't look at how the United States behaves in Ukraine and think, aha, that's what they'll do in the case of Taiwan. They understand that Taiwan is different. They understand that Japan is different. They understand that in different contexts, the U.S. will behave differently. So I don't see the U.S. walking away here as then leading to a Chinese conclusion that the U.S. will is weak and the U.S. won't defend Taiwan. That may be true, but they're not going to get that from just looking at Ukraine. I think the other key thing to remember is that the decision to invade Taiwan or to conduct some sort of military aggression in Asia would be a risky one for China. It doesn't know if it's going to succeed. It would be very costly. It would certainly change the security posture of all other countries in the region. It's not going to make that decision based on something that happens in Ukraine. It's going to make that decision based on developments in its region and when it thinks its military is ready to be successful. So, if anything, what she has learned here is that he better be really ready to take Taiwan quickly if he decides to do it. As far as damaging,
and I'm sorry, just one more minute. I want to get one last little bit in there. If Trump doesn't walk away, what does that do to American interests?
Well, if Trump doesn't walk away and stays embroiled in the conflict, we're just sort of left in the status quo. I think the worst case outcome is if Trump commits the United States and gets it more deeply involved. I think that would be hard to do with just Russia in the room. I'd be more concerned if he was somehow, negotiating with Ukraine and offered binding security guarantees or something else like that. So I guess for me, the worst case scenario here is not all that bad. It's just that we go back to the sort of status quo of, failed diplomacy and continued war. And that is a possibility because Russia is still gaining on the battlefields and has mixed incentives here to make real concessions.
Well, I guess we're going to find out tomorrow, and hopefully President Trump listens to all 5 of those, especially the last one. 5 key points for the Trump-Putin era. That's we've got that listed on our explanation here on the description section if you want to go find it, or just Google it. It's a great big read. Thanks so much, Jennifer, for coming on today. We, as always, really appreciate your views.
Thank you.
And we thank you guys too very much. We're going to keep a close eye on everything that's happening in between here and Alaska on Friday, and you can count on Daniel Davis Deep Dive to bring it to you. Thanks very much. We'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.